Breaking. Trump orders Canadian water takeover. Carney stands firm. 20%. That's Canada's share of the entire planet's fresh surface water. Lakes, rivers, glaciers. The kind of resource that, in a world being slowly cooked alive by climate change, is worth more than oil, more than lithium, more than anything sitting in the ground right now. And Donald Trump knows it. Now, look. What's being discussed behind closed doors in Washington right now isn't just trade tariffs or border security theatrics. It's something far more fundamental, far more permanent. There are real signals from real policy moves, suggesting the United States is positioning itself to gain leverage over Canada's water. Not ask for it, leverage it. And Canada's new Prime Minister, Mark Carney, former central banker, one of the most economically sophisticated leaders on the planet right now, has looked Washington directly in the eye and said no. But here's the thing. By the time most people realize what this standoff is actually about, the negotiating table will already be set, and Canada might be sitting at the wrong end of it. While mainstream media is laser-focused on the tariff ping-pong, steel, aluminum, auto parts, dairy, the real story is happening in a completely different arena, one that most political analysts aren't even connecting yet. Water. Let's be real for a second. The American Southwest is running dry. The Colorado River Compact, the 1922 agreement that carved up water rights across 7 U.S. states, is collapsing in real time. Lake Mead and Lake Powell hit historically catastrophic lows just 2 years ago, and the projections don't get better, they get worse, significantly worse. Meanwhile, Canada sits on roughly 7% of the world's renewable freshwater supply. The Great Lakes alone hold about 21% of the world's entire surface fresh water. That's not a geographic footnote. That is a strategic asset of almost incomprehensible value in the world we are moving into. Now, connect those two facts. A superpower neighbor facing a long-term freshwater crisis. A smaller nation sitting on the world's largest freshwater system. And a president who has, openly, on camera, multiple times, floated the idea of absorbing Canada entirely. You tell me, does this feel like a coincidence, or does this feel like a setup? Because Carney doesn't think it's a coincidence, and he's moving like a man who knows exactly what game is being played. And today, we're going to break down every single layer of it, because this story is not going away, and the people who understand it early will be in a very different position from the people who catch up late. To understand what's happening right now, you have to understand how the United States has historically acquired access to resources it desperately needs. And the playbook, when you lay it out, is surprisingly consistent, almost mechanical. Step 1 is economic pressure. Tariffs, sanctions, trade restrictions. You make the target nation feel the financial squeeze. You create pain, not enough to trigger open conflict. Just enough to make leadership back home start asking hard questions about how long they can hold out. Step 2 is political reframing. You redefine the resource. Instead of sovereign property belonging to one nation, it becomes a shared continental asset, a mutual resource. Something that, by logic and geography and neighborly goodwill, should be accessible to both parties. The language shifts slowly, deliberately, almost imperceptibly, until the original framing has been replaced entirely. Step 3 is negotiation under duress. You wait. You let the economic pain accumulate. You let internal political pressure build inside the target country. And then you wait for them to come to the table, not from a position of strength, but from a position where making concessions feels like the only rational path forward. Believe it or not, this exact framework was already partially applied to Canadian water once before. During the original NAFTA negotiations in the early 1990s, there were serious internal debates, documented, on record, about whether bulk water exports should be classified as a tradable good under the agreement. Canada resisted hard. The language was kept deliberately ambiguous. And that ambiguity, rather than being resolved in subsequent years, was essentially baked into the architecture of North American trade. It never went away. CUSMA, the updated trade agreement Trump himself renegotiated during his first term, still contains that same structural gray area. Water in its natural state is not explicitly protected as a sovereign, non-tradable resource in the way most Canadians assume it is. Legal scholars in both countries have been quietly raising alarm bells about this for years, not loudly, not in headlines, but in law journals and policy briefings and the kind of documents that circulate in government buildings rather than newsrooms. So when Trump's team starts deploying tariffs at 25%, threatening to reclassify Canadian imports, rattling the economic cage in ways that seem almost deliberately destabilizing, it doesn't read as random. It reads as sequential. It reads like step 1 of a process that has a step 2 and a step 3 already mapped out. And here's what makes that genuinely alarming. The United States doesn't need to formally demand Canadian water to gain leverage over it. All it needs to do is make the economic cost of saying no high enough. Make the political pressure inside Canada intense enough. Make the alternative, some form of continental water sharing framework, seem reasonable by comparison. That is how you take something without taking it. And that is precisely the scenario that Mark Carney appears to be preparing for. But that's not even the craziest part, because while everyone's watching the tariff numbers and the trade deficit arguments, there's a second front opening up that almost no one is talking about. Here's what makes this moment genuinely different from every other Canada-US standoff in recent memory. The man sitting across from Trump's team isn't a career politician shaped by the comfortable rhythms of Canadian parliamentary consensus. Mark Carney is a former governor of the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England. He managed the UK through the economic trauma of Brexit. He has spent his entire professional life designing and implementing policy frameworks for managing sovereign economic shocks, situations where external forces are trying to dictate terms, and the only question is whether you have enough structural resilience to resist. He is, by any reasonable measure, one of the most financially sophisticated heads of government on the planet right now. And he is not blinking. Within weeks of taking office, Carney began making moves that look, in retrospect, like deliberate counterpositioning. He fast-tracked the removal of internal trade barriers between Canadian provinces, a long-standing domestic inefficiency that had been politically stalled for years, and reframed it overnight as a national security priority. The logic was clear. A Canada that trades freely within itself is a Canada that is less economically dependent on the United States. Less dependent means less leverage for Washington to pull. He simultaneously began accelerating Canada's trade diversification conversations. The European Union, Japan, the United Kingdom post-Brexit, markets that could, over time, absorb Canadian exports that currently flow south by default simply because the infrastructure and relationships for alternatives were never built. Now look, that's not reactive scrambling. That's a man methodically reducing his opponent's leverage before sitting down at the table. That's a chess player making quiet structural moves 3 turns before the exchange everyone else is watching. Carney has also been strikingly explicit, more explicit than any recent Canadian Prime Minister, about the sovereignty of Canadian resources. He hasn't reached for the soft diplomatic language that Canadian leaders typically default to. He hasn't talked about valued natural assets or collaborative stewardship frameworks. He has used the word sovereignty, directly, repeatedly, in contexts where the audience is not just Canadian voters, but Washington policy circles and international markets simultaneously. That language choice is not accidental. It is a signal. It is Carney drawing a line in public, on record, so that any subsequent attempt to pressure that line carries political and reputational cost for whoever applies the pressure. He is making the implicit explicit. He is forcing Washington to either back down or make a visible, documentable move against a neighbor's stated sovereign position. That is an extraordinarily sophisticated tactical maneuver, and it puts the United States in an uncomfortable position. Because the moment this becomes visibly, undeniably about Canadian water, rather than tariffs, trade balances, and border management, the international optics shift dramatically. You are no longer a superpower managing a trade dispute with a neighbor. You are a superpower pressuring a democratic ally over its natural resources. Those are very different stories, and Carney knows exactly which one the world prefers to watch. Whether Washington is fully accounting for that calculus is frankly unclear, and that uncertainty is part of what makes this moment so genuinely high stakes, And this is where it gets genuinely uncomfortable, because there's a third layer to this story, one that extends far beyond bilateral politics, one that involves the rest of the world, governments, investors, international institutions, watching this standoff very, very carefully and drawing their own conclusions. Here's the macro context that frames everything you've just heard, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. By 2040, less than 16 years from now, the United Nations projects that global demand for fresh water will outstrip available supply by approximately 40%, not in some distant theoretical scenario, in the professional lifespans of people already working today, in the retirement years of people who are currently in their late 40s. This is not a distant threat. This is a scheduled crisis with a known timeline. Countries already know this. Their intelligence services know it. Their long-term strategic planning offices know it. And the nations that control significant freshwater reserves are beginning to understand, slowly, then all at once, that they are sitting on the defining strategic resource of the coming century. Canada is one of maybe 4 or 5 countries on Earth in that position. Don't pass over that lightly, because history is very clear about what happens when a resource transitions from abundant to scarce. The politics around it transform entirely. What was once treated as background infrastructure becomes a weapon, a bargaining chip, a reason for conflict dressed up in the language of cooperation. We watched it happen with oil across the entire 20th century. We watched the United States build military infrastructure, foreign policy frameworks, and geopolitical alliances almost entirely around the logic of energy security. We watched what happened to nations that sat on oil but lacked the power to defend their claim to it. The pattern is not subtle. Now Russia uses natural gas as geopolitical leverage. That wasn't a surprise to anyone who was paying attention to the underlying resource math. Europe spent 3 decades building energy dependency into the architecture of its relationship with Moscow, and when the political relationship collapsed, the energy relationship became a weapon almost immediately. Brazil's Amazon watershed influences rainfall patterns across an entire hemisphere. Brazilian politicians and military planners know this. It shapes how Brazil approaches sovereignty over its rainforest in ways that confuse outside observers who frame the debate purely in environmental terms. It isn't just environmental, it's strategic. Canada has been the quiet outlier in this picture. Resource-rich, security comfortable under the American defense umbrella, economically integrated with its neighbor in ways that made friction seem mutually destructive and therefore unlikely. Canadian governments across multiple generations made the reasonable calculation that proximity to the United States was a protection rather than a vulnerability. That calculation is being stress-tested right now in real time. What Trump's posture, whether it is the product of sophisticated long-term strategic thinking or simply instinctual transactional pressure, has done is force a conversation that Canada was perfectly content to never have, about whether the resources it has always treated as permanent, untouchable domestic treasures are actually targets in the eyes of a neighbor facing compounding resource constraints. And here is the geographic reality that sits underneath all of the politics and all of the diplomacy and all of the carefully chosen language. The Great Lakes don't care about the border. The watersheds don't observe the line that was drawn in 1818. The aquifers and river systems that make Canada one of the most freshwater-rich nations on Earth are physically shared with or physically adjacent to the United States in ways that make clean, simple sovereignty arguments complicated to enforce in practice, even when they are legally sound in theory. The moment water becomes a hard negotiating chip, and we are closer to that moment than most people sitting in comfortable countries are prepared to admit, geography stops being a neutral background and starts being destiny. Carney can hold the line politically. He can absolutely do that. He can build international coalitions, diversify trade relationships, reduce bilateral dependency, and make the diplomatic cost of pressure so high that Washington recalculates. He is the right person in the right role at arguably the right moment to do exactly that. But the water doesn't move, and the drought in the American Southwest doesn't reverse because the diplomatic relationship is warm. And the projections about global freshwater scarcity don't soften because 2 governments have a constructive working relationship. The underlying resource math operates on a timeline that is completely indifferent to who is in office in Ottawa or Washington. What that means in practical terms is this. Even if Carney wins this particular standoff, even if Trump's tariff pressure fails, even if Canada successfully diversifies its economic relationships and reduces American leverage, the structural incentive for the United States to seek access to Canadian water doesn't disappear. It grows. Slowly, then quickly, as the climate math accumulates. This is not a crisis that gets resolved at a summit. It is a tension that gets managed, generation after generation, by whoever is skilled and serious enough to hold the line. Carney is betting that Canada can build the economic and diplomatic architecture to make that line permanent. Trump is betting that enough pressure, applied consistently, will eventually find a weak point. And the rest of the world, every government watching a freshwater table drop, every city manager rationing reserves, every agricultural minister running the numbers on the next 10 years, is watching this standoff and learning from it. Learning what works, learning what doesn't. Learning exactly how much it costs to defend something that everyone will eventually want. Because what Canada is defending right now, whether its public fully grasps it or not, is not just a trade negotiation outcome. It is a precedent, a demonstration to the entire international system that sovereign control over critical natural resources can be maintained even under sustained pressure from the most powerful economy on Earth. If Carney holds that line, it matters everywhere. If he doesn't, that also matters everywhere. If you want to stay ahead of this, the link in the description goes deeper, specifically into the CUSMA legal clause ambiguity, the documented water-sharing proposals that have already circulated in policy circles, and the financial analysis of what Canadian freshwater assets would represent on an open market. Otherwise, just keep a close eye on one specific thing. Watch the language coming out of Ottawa over the next 60 days. Not the headlines, not the press conference summaries, the actual language. Watch whether Carney's team shifts, even slightly, from the word sovereignty toward the word negotiation. That shift, if it comes, will tell you everything you need to know about who is winning this standoff before any deal is ever announced publicly. Because in geopolitics, the words change before the facts do. The 20th century was defined by who controlled the oil. The 21st century will be defined by who controls the water. And somewhere in Ottawa tonight, a former central banker is staring at a map of the Great Lakes and deciding exactly how much his country is prepared to fight for both.